The mistake in the movie The Exorcist. The name that should never be said. Have you ever heard that certain names should never be pronounced? I learned this the hard way. The first time I heard about this entity, it seemed like just a movie story. But when I realized that the mistake of releasing this name cursed the whole world, I understood the true meaning of opening a door that never closes. The first time I watched The Exorcist, I was just a curious teenager trying to impress my friends with horror stories. The truth is that I never really cared about these spiritual things. For me, it was all fiction, just a way to give some cheap scares. That changed completely one night when I decided to review the film myself, years later. I had heard some rumors about the name they mentioned in the story, but never really paid attention. That night, I decided to look into it. It was as if something pulled me to research, as if I needed to understand what was behind that word. I searched the name on Google, found some obscure pages, and read more than I should. It was not just curiosity, it was a feeling that I needed to know. The information speaks of ancient rituals, stories of people who supposedly had their lives destroyed just by speaking or thinking about this name for a long time. I started feeling a strange cold in the room while reading, but I kept on. My dog, who always stood by me, suddenly began to growl at the empty wall. It was then that I hit an almost physical discomfort, as if I was being observed. I turned off the computer, but that feeling didn't go away. The silence in my room seemed heavy, as if the air had become denser. My dog was still restless, now walking in circles near the door. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my head playing tricks. But then came the noise. It was a low sound, like something scratching the ground, but it came from under my bed. I was paralyzed. The idea of looking down terrified me, but curiosity, the same that made me research the name, won me. Slowly, I bent down to look. There was nothing there. At least, nothing my eyes could see. But the discomfort only increased. Went back to bed, trying to convince myself that it was okay, that I just needed to sleep. Then my phone turned on by itself. The screen showed the page I was reading, that about the entity. I was sure I had closed everything, but there she was, shining in the dark, as if calling me back. My heart popped. I could not move for a long time, just staring at that name on the screen. I decided that I would not sleep that night. I turned off my phone and left the room. I went into the living room, thinking that maybe the TV would help to relieve that mood. Only as soon as I sat down on the couch, the lights started flashing. It was not a normal power outage. It was intermittent, as if someone was flicking the switch. My dog, who had followed me there, suddenly let out a high-pitched groan and hid under the coffee table. I had never seen him act like this before. I sat there, frozen, trying to understand what was going on. It was when I heard that sound again, the scratch, only this time it didn't come from under me. He came from the walls, first to my right, then to my left, as if something was moving around me. Took my phone and started filming, more to feel protected than for any other reason. But what happened next was worse than anything I could have imagined. While I was recording, I realized that in the dark corner of the room, the camera captured something that my eyes did not see. A form, like a humanoid figure, seemed to be there, motionless, watching me. My hand was shaking so much that I almost dropped the phone. I continued filming, unable to look away from that thing in the corner of the room. The face did not move, but it seemed to be taking shape, becoming more defined. It was as if the dark were molding itself into something real. Don't know why, but I kept looking through the camera. as if my eyes were not able to deal with it directly. The worst was when the light blinked one last time, briefly illuminating the room. There was nothing there, but when the darkness returned, the camera still showed the mound still standing, only now closer. Turned off my phone on impulse and ran to the room. I closed the door and threw myself in bed, trying to convince myself that I was imagining everything. But I knew it wasn't my own. My dog started scratching the door, whining as if he was trying to get in. When I opened it, he was no longer there. I looked down the hall, and he stood staring at the wall with his stiff body and panting breath. I called him, but he didn't move. That's when I noticed. The scratch had come back, only this time it seemed to come from inside the room. The scratch seemed to be coming from the wardrobe, a slow rhythmic sound, like nails scraping on wood. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. I knew I didn't want to open that door, but the idea of ignoring it made me even more terrified. Took the phone again, turned on the flashlight, and with trembling hands went to the wardrobe. At each step, the sound became louder, closer. When I finally opened the door, it was empty. Nothing but clothes hanging. But the sound continued, only now it came from behind me. I turned my body so fast that I almost tripped. My room was empty, but the sound did not stop. He seemed to be inside my head now, as if something had outgrown the physical. I felt dizzy, as if the air had become heavier, denser. It was at this moment that the lights of the whole apartment went out. Only the silence remained. Neither the sound of scratching, nor the sound of my dog, nothing. When I finally got the courage to leave the room, the apartment looked different. Colder, more empty, as if something had been drained from there. To this day, I don't know what that was. But since that night, I never got to watch The Exorcist or even think about searching for that name again. When the abyss watches you back. My aunt was a quiet woman, until the day she did something seemingly harmless, an internet search. What started as curiosity ended with sleepless nights, smell of sulfur in the apartment, and a series of events that even science could not explain. If you think the internet is just a place to search, think again. My Aunt Alice was always one of those people who didn't believe in any of that spirituality or supernatural stuff. She was practical, you know, a woman who solved everything with logic and feet on the ground. But that changed completely a few years ago, when something she never knew how to explain began to happen. She was researching a project on the internet, something about symbology and ancient art, and ended up falling into a strange forum. Don't know how exactly she got there, but that's when it started. She found a topic that mentioned the name of an entity, something that seemed harmless at first, just another curiosity. But she told me after that, while reading, felt a shiver in the back of those who you do not know where they come from, but make you look over your shoulder. On the same night, she began to notice strange things in the apartment. Alice lived alone on the 12th floor of an old building and was always super organized. But that night, she swore she heard footsteps in the hallway. Steps that seemed to come from inside the apartment, even with all the doors locked. She said she thought it was paranoia, maybe tiredness, then ignored. But what really bothered her was the smell. A strong smell, like burnt brimstone, appeared out of nowhere and seemed to follow her through the house. She cleaned everything, checked the drain, even threw out some cleaning products thinking it was that. But the smell did not go away. And according to her, that's when she started feeling like she wasn't alone in that place anymore. The next day, she tried to go on with the routine, but something seemed out of place. Alice told me that while she was having breakfast, she noticed that the pictures in the room were crooked. She was sure they were aligned the night before, because she was meticulous with those details. He corrected the pictures, thinking that it might have happened during the night, but when he came back from the kitchen with more coffee, the pictures were crooked again. Only this time, it was not a common misalignment. They seemed to be hanging on purpose, forming a strange pattern, something she could not describe well, but that seemed deliberate. It was at this moment that she began to feel a real fear. The smell of sulfur came back, stronger than ever. And that's not all. Alice started to hear the sound of something falling into another room, but every time she went to check it out, there was nothing on the floor. The wine bottles she kept in a small cellar were intact, but she swore she heard the glass shattering. That night, she called a friend to spend some hours with her, but nothing happened while he was there. As soon as he left, the smell returned, and this time, the neighbor's dog started howling without stopping. She sat on the couch, lights on, trying to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched, she wouldn't leave. That night, Alice decided to sleep with the light on. She thought it would help, but said it was the opposite. The light seemed to create shadows where they had not existed before. She swore that she saw something move in the corner of the room, but when she looked directly, there was nothing. Then, while she was lying down, she heard again the sound of footsteps, only now they were sharper, as if someone was walking down the corridor. She held her breath, trying to convince herself that it was her head, but the steps stopped right at the side of the door of the room. She said that at that moment, she felt a presence so strong that it was as if the air had become heavier. Alice had no courage to get out of bed. She stood there, with her heart beating, waiting for it to pass. It was when the wine bottles, which were intact before, really shattered. The sound was so loud that she thought the whole apartment had collapsed. When he finally had the courage to open the bedroom door, he saw the shards scattered around the room, as if they had been thrown against the wall. The smell of sulfur was unbearable now, and the neighbor's dog, which previously only howled, began to bark and scratch the door of her apartment. Alice told me she never felt as close to losing her sanity as she did that night. Alice said that at that time she didn't know what else to do. She tried to call the friend who had been with her earlier, but the phone just didn't connect. It was not a lack of signal, it was as if the connection could not be made. So she decided to do what her mother always said when she was a child, pray. But, according to her, that's when things got even worse. While she tried to recite a prayer that reminded her of childhood, the smell of sulfur intensified to the point of making her cough and tear. And then she heard a low, muffled laugh that seemed to come from all corners of the apartment at once. At that moment, Alice ran to the front door, determined to leave the house, but the key did not turn in the lock. She struggled with the door for several minutes, until she noticed something that made her blood cold. The laughter had stopped, but now there were whispers. Weak, undecipherable but unmistakable. It was as if several voices were speaking at the same time, but none of them were human. She gave up trying to get out and ran back into the room, locking the door behind her. She spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, with her back against the wall, praying that it would be morning soon. And when the sun finally appeared, everything stopped. The smell disappeared, the sounds ceased, and the apartment was in absolute silence, as if nothing had happened. Code 666, more than a number. Since I was a child, I have heard stories about the number 666, but I never imagined that it was more than a symbol. When I delved into the numerology behind this code, I found that it does not represent only evil, but something even more disturbing: the attempt to transform man into something divine. And the consequences of this are everywhere. I never paid much attention to these stories about the number 666. For me, it was just one of those things that people use to scare others, like Halloween stories or horror movies. But that changed completely a few months ago, when a casual conversation at work took me to a deeper hole than I ever imagined. We were at lunch, and a colleague mentioned something about the spiritual geometry behind biblical numbers. It was not my type of talk, but he seemed so obsessed that I became curious and decided to research when I came home. The idea was just to kill curiosity, but it was like opening a door for something that should never have been touched. I started with a simple search on the number 666, but soon came across strange forums and websites. There was discussion about how the number was related not only to evil, but to the attempt to attain divinity in a selfish way. They talked about ancient symbolism, rituals, and connections with historical figures who supposedly used this number to manipulate power. The more I read, the more I felt involved. It was as if something pulled me to continue, even when the discomfort began to beat. I spent hours reading until, on a specific site, appeared a message that seemed personalized. The man who tries to be God gets lost in the abyss. At the time, I felt a chill. It was not as if I believed it, but something in that text seemed to be talking directly to me. After that message, everything in the environment began to look different. My office, which has always been my safe place, suddenly seemed smaller, more stuffy. I looked at the computer screen, but couldn't concentrate. The message kept echoing in my head. I decided to go out for some air, but the feeling of discomfort was with me. It was as if someone were watching me, even as I walked through the streets of my neighborhood. I came home with a weight on my chest, thinking it was just fatigue or paranoia. But when I entered the apartment, something was different. I can't explain how, but it seemed like there was a presence there. I decided to ignore it and went straight to the bath. That's when the first thing happened that really scared me. As the water was falling, I noticed that the steam in the glass of the box began to form something that looked like a symbol. It was not exactly the number 666, but had something related to it, like a repetitive pattern. I tried to wipe it with my hand, but it seemed to reappear whenever the steam came back. I left the bathroom feeling my heart racing, with the feeling that it was more than a coincidence. I took my phone to search more about what I had read, but the internet started to crash. It was as if something or someone did not want me to find out more. Even with the phone locking, insists on opening the pages that had saved earlier. I was able to access one of the forums where people shared stories about the number 666 and what it represented. A particular post caught my attention. It was someone who said he experienced strange phenomena after trying to decipher the numerological patterns associated with the number. They mentioned how 6, repeated 3 times, represented not only evil but the human ego in its most extreme form, trying to take God's place. It was something symbolic, but the way it was described seemed to carry a real weight. I started feeling uncomfortable again, as if reading that was some kind of permission for something to approach. As I was reading, I heard a sound coming from the room, as if something heavy had fallen. I froze. I walked slowly there, hoping to see my cat or something that I had left in an unstable balance. But when I arrived, everything was exactly as I had left it. The TV was off, the curtains still. But the sound happened again, this time behind me in the corridor. I turned so fast that I almost lost my balance, but there was nothing there. It was only when I realized that the wall clock, which had stopped working months ago, was suddenly marking the exact time that I felt something was profoundly wrong. My breath was so heavy that I could hear the sound of my heart echoing in the silence of the apartment. I decided to take the watch to look closer. It was 3:33 in the morning. I don't know why, but this number made me even more uneasy. It was as if the sequence carried some hidden meaning that I could not understand, but which seemed directly connected to everything I had read that night. When I hung the clock back on the wall, the second hand just stopped again, as if it had never worked. Then I heard a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It was something like, "Don't look anymore." But the voice, she didn't sound human. It was low, husky, almost electronic. I wanted to believe that I was imagining everything. Maybe it was fatigue, or even my brain playing tricks after so many hours reading about disturbing things. But when I looked at my computer screen, there was something there that I definitely hadn't written. In the place where the forum page was before, now had a message in red, with large and deformed letters. "You open the door." Now it doesn't close. I was paralyzed. My only reaction was to turn off the computer as fast as I could and leave the apartment. I took the car key and drove for hours, without destination, trying to convince myself that it was all a coincidence, but knowing deep down that it was not. I came home when the sun was already rising, trying to convince myself that daylight would bring some sense of normality. But the discomfort did not go away. The apartment was exactly as I had left it, but the air still seemed heavy charged. Turned on all the lights and sat on the couch, without courage to turn on the computer again. That's when I noticed something on the floor of the room, near the wall clock. It was like a symbol, drawn in a thin layer of dust. It wasn't there before, I'm sure. It was a circular pattern, with 3 lines intersecting in the center. It didn't seem like something that happened by chance. After that day, I never messed with the search for 666 or anything related to it. Deleted all the links I had saved, threw out the clock, and even moved to another apartment. But even after all this, there are times when I feel like I haven't completely gotten rid of what happened. Sometimes during the night, I wake up with the feeling that I am being watched. And more than once, I have seen the same symbol that appeared that morning, whether in the steam of the mirror, in the dust of the floor, or in dreams that leave me awake for hours. Don't know what really happened that day, but one thing I learned: some doors, once opened, never close completely. The teacher and the forbidden film. I had a teacher that I will never forget. He knew more about spirituality than seemed possible, and his presence already caused chills. One day, he told us why the movie The Exorcist should never have existed. His words echoed in my mind for days. They opened a door that should never have touched. That's when I realized that horror in the movies was not just fiction. It was my last semester in journalism school, and I will never forget Professor Harris's class. He had a presence that held you. It was not just the way he spoke, but something in the way he carried an aura of authority. They said he was a Mason, and sometimes he wore a ring that seemed to confirm it. I never cared about this kind of thing, but what he told me in a class about cinema left me with a shiver that I still feel when I remember. We were discussing the cultural influence of the films, and he mentioned The Exorcist. I thought it would be just another conversation about the controversy and impact of the film, but it wasn't. He said, "This film made a mistake that should never have been allowed. They opened a door that should have been closed." The silence in the room was instantaneous. No one knew exactly what he meant, but Harry seemed to speak with a weight that made it clear that it was not just theory. He explained that the film had used the real name of an entity, something that should never be done, and that this had consequences. They thought they were telling a story, but calling out such a name is more than words, he said, looking directly at us. It was not just an academic warning. He seemed to be talking about something that he had witnessed himself. It stayed in my head for the rest of the day. I had seen The Exorcist before, but never paid attention to names or spiritual details. That night, I decided to review the film to understand what he was talking about. I watched the film alone in my room, with the lights off, trying to capture what the teacher had mentioned. I was writing down the names that appeared, trying to understand something that might have escaped me before. Halfway through the film, a specific word caught my attention. I can't explain why, but it seemed to resonate differently. I found obscure forums, poorly translated pages and comments from people warning never to repeat the name aloud. But of course, I didn't take it seriously. While reading, I felt something strange in the environment. It was nothing I could see or hear, but it seemed like the room was getting colder even with the heater on. My monitor started blinking, something that had never happened before. I shrugged, thinking it was a technical problem, but the feeling of discomfort did not go away. It was as if someone was watching me. When I turned off the computer and got up, I heard a sound coming from the hallway. It sounded like a low whisper, almost inaudible, but enough to make me freeze in place. I tried to convince myself that the sound was just my imagination. After all, it was late, I was alone, and my mind was full of ideas about what I had read. But the whisper came back, clearer this time. It was a husky, low voice, as if speaking straight into my ear, even though I was in the middle of the room. My heart began to beat so fast that I could hear the blood beating in my ears. I took my cell phone to turn on the flashlight and walked slowly down the hall. There was nothing there, but the air was heavy and the silence seemed suffocating. It was then that I heard the sound of something crawling behind me. I turned quickly, hoping to see something fallen or even my own shadow, but the room was just as it was, except for the computer. It was on again, even if I had turned off minutes earlier. On the screen there was an open page that I had never seen. It was a kind of forum, but not in English. The words were strange, incomprehensible, but in the center of the page was the same name I had heard in the film and searched earlier. It was as if someone or something had taken me there. My first impulse was to turn everything off again, but before I could move, the monitor blinked and the room light went out for good. I stood there in the dark, trying to control my breath, but it seemed as if the air was being sucked out of the room. The silence was so dense that even my own movements seemed amplified. It was then I saw something that almost made me lose balance. In the reflection of the computer screen, which still emitted a weak light, there was a shadow behind me. It wasn't mine. It was higher, immobile, but with an indefinite shape, as if the dark had gained contours. My mind screamed that I should not look directly, but my body did not obey. When I turned around, the shadow was no longer there. The monitor, however, began to emit a low hum, something between static sound and a murmur. The page on the computer now showed something different. A countdown I had not seen before, as if something was about to happen. The counter blinked, and next to it, the same word that the teacher had said to avoid. I approached cautiously, not knowing if I was turning off the monitor or running away. But before I could decide, the count came to 0. The monitor went out, and the room was taken by a silence that seemed even more oppressive. I stood there for minutes, maybe hours, trying to understand what had happened, until the computer restarted itself. Everything was normal again, as if nothing had happened. But since then the feeling of being observed never went away. The meaning of number 5 and the princes of hell. Do you believe that numbers can contain power? When I heard about number 5 and its connection with the 4 princes of hell and Lucifer, something changed. Each letter, each symbol, each combination seems to carry more than simple mathematics. But the truth about Baal and the hidden meaning of this number left me with a weight on my chest that I cannot describe. I never believed in numerology or anything like that. For me, numbers were just numbers. But that changed the day a friend showed me a theory about number 5 and the hidden symbology behind it. He was the kind of person obsessed with mysteries and conspiracies. So at first I saw everything as a curious conversation and nothing more. But that night, something in the way he described the connection between number 5, the 4 princes of hell, and Lucifer made me want to research on my own. It was a mistake. I remember opening a page on the internet that explained the relationship between the letters of the name Baal and the infernal princes, and it seemed that every word was etching itself in my head in a way that I could not ignore. As I read, I began to feel a weight in the air, as if the environment around me was becoming denser. I was taken by a feeling of discomfort difficult to explain, but I continued. I found that the number 5, when associated with entities like Baal, was not just a mathematical coincidence. There was something deeper, something that seemed more like a code than just a number. The explanations talked about symbols, rituals, and how repeating the number in specific contexts could open doors. I didn't quite understand what it meant to open doors, but as I was reading, I heard a sound in my room. A clatter, like wood squeaking, followed by a silence so deep that I could hear my own breath. I tried to ignore the sound and keep reading, but it was impossible not to feel the discomfort increasing. Closed the browser tab and went to the kitchen to distract me. While I filled a glass of water, I noticed that the wall clock, which marked exactly 9:45, seemed to be stopped. This had happened before, so I thought the batteries were out. But when I returned to the room, I saw that the computer clock was wrong too. He blinked 5 o'clock repeatedly, as if he had locked at that time. A coincidence, I thought, trying to convince myself that it had nothing to do with what I was researching. But the repetition of number 5 began to make me uneasy. I decided to turn off the computer and go to sleep. But when I went to bed, I started to notice that the environment around me seemed different. The room was colder, although it was summer. And then came the sound again, louder this time. It was a scratch, as if someone were fingernail licking the wall behind my bed. I got up in a leap, turned on the light, and there was nothing there. But the sound did not stop. He seemed to move from one wall to another, as if something was walking around me. My heart was racing, and I felt a cold sweat running down my forehead. That's when I realized that number 5 was scribbled in the dust of my dresser, something I was sure wasn't there before. I stood still, staring at the numbers on the dresser, trying to find a rational explanation. I was never the kind of superstitious person, but that was hard to ignore. I took a cloth to clean, as if it would erase the discomfort alone. As I rubbed the dust, I noticed that the marks were not just on the surface. They looked like little grooves in the wood. A shiver ran through my spine. I left the room and went to the living room, trying to think of something else. but the feeling of being observed did not leave me. Each shadow seemed darker than normal, and the silence was so absolute that it hurt your ears. That's when the lights started to flash. First in the room, then in the hallway, until the whole house sank into darkness. Took my phone and turned on the flashlight, but the light seemed weak, barely lighting a meter in front of me. As I pointed to the corridor, something made me freeze. On the wall, scribbled with the same pattern I saw in the dresser, was number 5, repeated several times, forming a kind of circle. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea how it got there. The only thing that was going through my mind was that I wasn't alone at home anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, but every cell of my body was screaming to get out. I started walking slowly to the front door, with the cell phone's flashlight shaking in my hand. But before I could reach the handle, the sound came back. It was a scratch, but now it seemed to come from all sides. It seemed that the walls were alive, as if something was trying to come out of them. I looked around, looking for some explanation, but could only see the shadows projected by the lantern. It was then that I noticed something in the mirror of the corridor. It was not my reflection, it was something else. The silhouette of something tall, slender, with shapes that did not seem human. My legs almost failed when I turned to look directly into the mirror. But, as before, there was nothing there. Still, the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. The sound of the scratch stopped as abruptly as it started, but was replaced by something worse. A low, almost imperceptible laugh that seemed to come from inside my head. I wanted to scream, but my throat seemed stuck. The only thing I could do was to lean against the door, trying not to collapse, while that laughter continued, slowly increasing, until it became almost unbearable. Closed my eyes, clenching my hands against my ears, but the laughter did not stop. It seemed to echo within me, as if it was impregnated in my mind. Suddenly everything became silent. Not a normal silence, but something absolute, oppressive, as if the sound had been torn from the environment. When I opened my eyes, I saw that number 5 was scratched on all the mirrors and reflective surfaces of the apartment. Don't know how it happened, but it was everywhere, repeated as a hypnotic pattern. It was then that I heard something that made me freeze. My own name whispered coming from the corridor. Without thinking twice, I opened the front door and ran out. I didn't take anything with me. I just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. I spent the night in the car, parked on the street, with the engine running and the doors locked. When I came back the next day, the apartment looked normal, but I knew it wasn't. The scribbles were gone, the mirror was clean, and the environment seemed empty, as if the whole house had lost something that was there before. Since that day, I have never searched for anything on the number 5 or anything related to Baal. Yet sometimes, in the silence of the night, I feel as if that number kept watching me, waiting for a new chance to appear. The young man who saw angels. When he entered my office, he was constantly looking back, as if something was following him. He said he saw angels, but something about the way he spoke did not seem right. The truth about what he was actually seeing made me question whether all those who see the divine are even looking for something good. I will never forget that day. I had served many people in difficult situations, but when Daniel came into the room, something looked different. He was about 20 years old, but he looked younger. He was thin with deep eyes and had a restless look, as if looking for something or someone. He would not stop looking back, every time someone passed by the hall or when he heard a distant noise. When I wanted to help, he looked at me for a few seconds and in a low voice said, They are here now, the angels. Can't you see? I confess that it caught me by surprise. I had heard similar stories before, but something in his tone didn't seem right. It was not fun or tranquil. It was fear. I tried to conduct a conversation calmly, asking what he meant by that. He said that, a few weeks ago, he began to see figures shown with huge wings appearing in the corners of the room, in the bathroom mirror, or even when he was walking down the street. At first he thought it was a good thing, a kind of victory. But over time, these figures began to get closer, watching him while he slept, whispering things that he did not understand. They're not like the paintings, he said, almost crying. They're huge, distorted, and the eyes. They just look at me, but it seems that they want something from me. That gave me the creeps. There was something about the way he spoke that made me believe that whatever he was selling wasn't exactly divine. As he spoke, I felt the weight of his words as if something was paired in the room. He said that the apparitions were more frequent during the night, but that finally they also followed him during the day. I see their shadows before they even appear completely, he said, staring at the wall as if they were waiting for something to come out there. I asked if he had talked to anyone about it, but he shook his head. No one believes me. They say it's my mind playing tricks, but I know it isn't. He started crying, holding his head between his hands. I don't know if they want to protect me or if they are waiting for me to do something, but I can't sleep anymore. At that moment, something changed. He became tense, as if he was hearing something I could not grasp. "Did you hear that?" he said with a trembling voice. I said no, but he insisted, pointing to the office window. "They are outside." "I know they are." I got up and went to the window, more to calm him than to believe. Outside, everything seemed normal, but his gaze remained fixed, as if he was seeing something that my eyes could not reach. It was when he said something that made me cold inside. "They are not the saving kind. They just wait, and when they're ready, they take you." I stood still for a moment, trying to process what he had just said. I asked what he meant by "they take you," but he looked away, as if he was afraid to answer. "I don't know," he said, almost in a whisper, "but every night they come closer. At first it was just one. Now there are 3, sometimes 4. He looked at the window again, nervous. "They wake me up. Don't leave me alone. And when they close their eyes, I see things, places that I have never been, but that seem to call me. It is not a dream. It's like I'm being pulled in there. That made me restless." I decided to ask him if he had any medical or spiritual help, but he interrupted me before I finished the sentence. "No use. They don't go away. I tried to pray. I tried to ignore it, but they always come back, and each time they seem less like angels." His last sentence hit me like a punch in the stomach. It was obvious that he believed what he was saying, and the way he described the experiences was so vivid that it was hard not to feel something was wrong. Whatever it was, it seemed to be completely consumed. I tried to bring the conversation back to something more concrete, asking if he remembered anything specific that might have triggered it. He was silent for a while, with his eyes lost, before answering. "I think it started after that night in the park. I was walking alone, it was late, and felt like someone was following me. When I looked back, there was no one, but the air was strange, heavy. It was when I saw a light, very weak, in the middle of the trees. I thought it was a burned-out pole or something, but the light started moving. And then I saw. It was a bright but deformed figure looking straight at me. I didn't move. I couldn't move." He took a long pause, taking a deep breath before continuing. Since then they have not left me alone. I think I opened something that night. I don't know what they want, but I feel it's not good. I tried to comfort him, say it was maybe something he could get over, but he shook his head before I even finished. You don't understand. They don't go away. And the worst thing is that even with all this fear, sometimes I feel like I want to go with them. As if whatever it was inevitable. He got up and left the room without saying anything more. To this day, I wonder if he found peace or if the angels finally took him. The mixture of psychiatric and spiritual problems. Not everything is what it seems. Sometimes what we think is spiritual is a confusion of lost minds. But when do the spiritual and mental mix? Have witnessed cases where I did not know where the madness ended and began possession. This is one of those cases. I was in the ministry a few years ago when I received a call for help that marked me forever. It was a woman named Emily, mother of a 19-year-old boy named Peter. She came to me in despair, saying that her son had started to show strange behavior in the last few months. He woke up in the middle of the night, shouting incomprehensible things, and said to hear voices that ordered him to do absurd things. Emily had already taken Peter to doctors and psychiatrists, but nothing seemed to work. The drugs only made it worse, and according to her, the voices were louder and more frequent. I don't know what else to do. It seems he is no longer my son, she said, tears in her eyes. I went to their house that same week, and upon entering, I felt a discomfort difficult to explain. It was not exactly fear, but the environment had a weight, as if something invisible was there, hovering. Peter was sitting on the couch, motionless, staring at the off-screen TV. I tried to talk, but he just looked away without saying a word. After a few minutes, he began to murmur something so low that it was difficult to understand. I came closer, and that's when I felt the first shiver. He was repeating a passage from the Bible, but backwards, in a voice that seemed not to be his. Emily was paralyzed, and I tried to keep calm, but my heart was racing. I didn't know if that was a serious psychiatric case or something much worse. I tried to stay calm and asked Emily if that behavior was common. She nodded, saying that Peter sometimes stayed like this for hours, repeating things no one understood. I decided to try talking to him again. I sat down next to him, keeping a safe distance, and asked how he was feeling. He finally looked up at me, but what I saw made me uneasy. His gaze seemed empty, but at the same time loaded with something I can't describe, as if there was something else there, wearing him as a mask. He smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was cold, disconcerting. Then he whispered, "You also hear, don't you?" I was speechless for a moment. I asked what he wanted to say, but he only started laughing softly, as if he had just told a joke that no one else understood. Suddenly he got up and went to the room without saying anything more. Emily ran after him, worried, and left me alone in the room. That's when I noticed something I hadn't noticed before, a series of symbols scribbled on the wall near the TV. They were not ordinary drawings. They seemed repetitive patterns, almost like writing that I did not recognize. I took my phone to take a picture, but as I approached, a low sound like a hum began echoing through the room, and the lights flickered briefly. The hum continues, low but pulsating, as if it comes from inside the walls. I took a step back, trying to understand what was happening when Emily came running back from the room. She was pale, panting, and told me that Peter had locked the door and was not answering. I ran up there with it, knocking on the door and calling his name, but all we heard was a strange noise, as if he was scratching something from the other side. That's when Emily started crying, begging him to open. By then my heart was racing. There was something profoundly wrong there, and I knew it wasn't just psychological. Suddenly, the scratch stopped, and the silence that came next was even worse. We tried to open the door, but it seemed stuck, as if something was holding on the other side. It was then that we heard the voice of Peter, but it did not sound the same. It was more grave, hoarse, almost guttural. He started talking fast, in a language I didn't know. Emily was even more terrified, holding my arm and asking me to do something. I told her to step away, and tried to break down the door. After a few attempts, she finally opened. When we came in, the room was empty. There was no sign of Peter, but the walls were covered by the same symbols I had seen in the room, only now made with something that looked like blood. Emily started shouting Peter's name, but he was nowhere. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and that buzzing seemed louder now, as if it came from under the floor. I looked around, trying to keep my head in place, but everything there seemed wrong. The curtains were torn, the bed rolled over, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulsate in the dim light of the corridor. Then I heard something coming from the closet. It was a low sound, an irregular breath, almost like a cornered animal. Emily ran to open the door, but I stopped her, fearing what we might find. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that I needed to open. When I pulled the door, the closet was empty. But in the background, almost imperceptible, there was another symbol drawn, different from the others, but equally disturbing. Before I could examine him better, a laugh echoed through the house. It didn't come from the room or the living room. It seemed to be everywhere. Emily fell to her knees, crying, and I felt the air getting heavier, almost suffocating. In the middle of the panic, I tried to pray, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the hum and laughter. Suddenly everything stopped. The hum, the laughter, the cold. The house went back to silence. Peter was never found again, and I could never explain what happened that night. The curse of curiosity. You just want to understand what's going on, he said. But it's not always safe to understand. Sometimes curiosity is the key to a door that should never be opened. When I finally realized it, it was too late to close mine. I never believed that curiosity could be something dangerous. I always thought that wanting to understand things was a positive trait, a way of growing up. That is until I met Mark, a boy who came to me for help. He seemed like the kind of person who liked to explore mysteries, but there was something about him that bothered me. He had a restless look, almost disturbed, and spoke fast, as if in a hurry. I just want to understand what's happening to me, he said repeatedly. The story he told me made me uncomfortable. Mark had been involved in dark internet forums, researching ancient symbols, entities, and rituals. It all started as curiosity, but quickly turned into something he could not control. Mark said that after weeks of diving into these topics, he began to notice strange things around him. Sounds in the middle of the night, shadows moving, a constant feeling of being watched. He tried to ignore it, but things only got worse. He said that one night, while researching further on a specific symbol, the computer shut down by itself. When he called again, there was a message on the screen, something he didn't write. You opened the door. It terrified him, but instead of stopping, he went deeper into it, trying to understand what was going on. He wanted answers, and in doing so, it seemed to be only sinking further. As he told, it was as if every word that came out of his mouth brought a greater weight to the room. He said that, a few nights later, He woke up in the middle of the morning with the sound of something scratching the walls of the room. At first he thought it was his own head, maybe a bad dream. But the sound continued, rhythmic, like nails scraping on wood. He stood up to investigate, but the room was empty. When he returned to bed, he saw something that made his blood cold. The symbol he had searched for so many times was scribbled in the dust of the mirror. He tried to erase, but the drawing seemed to reform every time the steam from the bathroom took over the glass. It was like it wasn't just research. It was something real. I asked what he did after that, and Mark burst out with a nervous laugh, as if he had no choice but to continue. I needed to know what it was. If it was just a coincidence or something more. Then he went back to the computer, but everything started going wrong. Sites he had never accessed appeared in the history. Enigmatic messages appeared in the comments, as if someone or something was guiding him. What he thought was control was slipping out of his hands. I wanted answers, he repeated, staring at the floor. But I think the only thing I did was invite someone in. As he spoke, I could see that his curiosity had turned into obsession. He said that the night before our conversation, things had reached another level. He was researching more about that symbol when the lights in the house started to flash. Thought it was a power outage, but then realized that only the room he was in was affected. He heard a heavy sound, like something being dragged down the floor in the corridor, but when he went to look there was nothing there. But I felt that I was not alone, he said, his voice trembling. It was as if what he was looking for had finally found a way to him. After that, he could not sleep. Said that every time he closed his eyes, he saw distorted figures, tall and dark shadows that seemed to be waiting. They do not move. Just look at me, he said, shaking hands hard. He began to isolate himself, avoiding friends and family, but things did not get better. Mark confessed that the night before he tried to erase everything from his computer, but even after formatting, search-related files reappeared as if they had never been deleted. It was as if the computer itself was contaminated, stuck to what he had opened. I just wanted to understand, he repeated, but now it seemed more like an apology than an explanation. Mark finished his story with the almost inaudible voice, as if the words were hard to come out. He said that same morning, while getting ready to go out, he saw something in the bathroom mirror. It was not only the symbol that chased him, but a figure behind him still. He said he could not turn. He was paralyzed, staring at that distorted reflection, which seemed to smile at him. When he finally got the courage to move, the figure disappeared, but the fear remained. I don't know what it is, but it's with me now. Where I go, I feel it's there. And I can't stop. After our conversation, I tried to help Mark as much as I could, suggesting that he should move away from everything he had researched and seek spiritual and professional help. But he seemed unable to break out of this cycle. A few weeks later, I received a message from his mother. She said that Mark had left home one night and never came back. The only thing they found was his computer, with the screen frozen in a message. Did you know that this was not safe? To this day, I do not know if Mark managed to escape or if, as he feared, was consumed by the door that opened. What I learned from this experience is simple. Some curiosities are not worth the risk.